Well, hello everyone. I should first say thank you, Sophia, for inviting me over. It's always a pleasure to come here, and I hope this is something exciting and of interest to you guys. As Sophia was just mentioning, I live in this kind of double life of being an academic but also a practitioner, and that's not easy when you hold a kind of a full-time academic job. But nonetheless, I try, and I try under the guise of Cuartoymitad Architecture Landscape, together with two partners, Ana Miret and Ruth Vega. So the work you're going to see is a kind of collaborative work. That we are all academics, but we're also all practicing architects. And we think this makes for a kind of interesting combination of sensibilities and interests, in which one part of one aspect of our work influences the other, and we kind of influence one another. So without further ado, Einmal ist Keinmal. This talk has a theoretical subtext to it, and you might have read it in the abstract, which talks about Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher. I'm going to talk about it, of course, but I'm just going to go straight into the meat of the lecture, and we'll discuss some of the theoretical underpinnings later. And I'm going to do this because basically I'm going to talk about a project that we did recently in the practice. And rather than talking about the end results all the time, or present it to you as if this was something extremely stylized and finalized, what I would like to do in this talk is to talk about the nitty-gritty, what's behind all of these kind of competition panels and stuff that we architects do. As they say in Spanish, I'm going to in a way take you to my kitchen, if that makes any sense, rather than showing you the plates. So, but Einmal ist Keinmal. Does anyone speak or read German here at all? This is because as part of my education and my early kind of career, I spent a number of years in Germany. I learned the language, and I was kind of fascinated by the culture and this kind of Germanistic take on things. German is a highly structured language, and often, but also very nuanced. Often translating some of these German expressions and sayings into English or Spanish proves to be almost impossible, and I quite like. I'm particularly fond of this one. Einmal ist Keinmal. If we start translating, if we use Google Translate, Einmal means once, and Keinmal means never. Now, of course, this is not a very accurate translation. If we try to actually put these two terms together, it goes something along the line of once is not even once, which doesn't really help that much. This is more accurate. Once is nothing at all. And I think that starts to make sense for us as architects. Essentially, what Einmal ist Keinmal means is that in the field of production, in the field of experience, be it architectural, be it artistic, be it, pretty much any field of creation or any kind of aspect of experiencing that creation, experiencing or producing or doing something once is essentially irrelevant. It doesn't really amount to much. You have to do it over and over and over again, because in doing so, you start to capture the many layers and nuances of the thing itself that you were producing or experiencing or whatever. So in a way, trying to do something once and leaving it there is really not a way to produce anything of interest, and this is precisely what I would like to prove in my own body of work and the body of work that I develop with my partners. So hopefully this will start to make sense as soon as I start flicking slides, and I have a lot of slides which I will flick through very, very quickly because it's the whole thing that I would like you to see and how it progresses from one thing to the other. Again, once does not count. Please keep this in mind. We try to practice, and often we do competitions when we find, we can carve up a bit of time. One we did relatively recently took place in the Faroe Islands. Does anyone know where the Faroe Islands are? If you're in Scotland, it makes a bit more sense. So the Faroe Islands is a kind of quasi-independent country. It's part of the crown of Denmark, but it has its own kind of independent parliament and actually its own flag and so on. It's, I think, 1 hour and a half by plane from Edinburgh up north. It's kind of in between Scotland, Denmark, and Iceland, in the middle of the ocean. It's a very, very rugged place with 30,000 inhabitants. In a way, it reminds me very often of the Highlands, only to a kind of more extreme, taken to a further extreme. As you see, it's kind of carved archipelago with no trees whatsoever, a very rough climate, very windy, and a beautiful, beautiful landscape, kind of a volcanic landscape. In this context, in the third city by size of the Faroe Islands, which is called Runavík, and you can see what it means to be the third city by size in a place like this. There was this competition to develop a master plan for new urban housing, aimed particularly at the younger generations, but also it was targeting the elderly as a kind of population. So in a way, it had to do with developing a sort of big housing master plan of at least 100 units, but we didn't know that at the time. So that figure was not even particularly clear. As you can imagine, adding 100 housing units into this scheme really makes for a kind of an additional 25% or 30% of the built surface of this place, which again has very, very interesting topographical conditions. So as you see, it's not flat by any means. The coast is actually a fjord, one of these kind of indentations of the sea into the land. The topography is very rugged, again, no trees, quite steep, basaltic rock as the kind of the main material of the land, just a bit of grazing and pastures. That's as much as you get. And the kind of the differences in height and slope are massive very quickly as soon as you leave the town. So this is the site in which we were meant to develop this housing project. There's something quite interesting about the traditions of the Faroe Islands, and in a way this carries a kind of anthropological study with it, alongside with the architectural project. So the tradition of the commons and commoning and kind of keeping common land is still going really strong. So the seeps kind of are on site, and they're expected to remain on site even after the housing units are built. These are just communal seep alongside with kind of privately owned seep. People keep their own animals, geese, ducks, chicken, and so on, and that's part of the kind of urban landscape of the Faroe Islands. Fishing is the kind of major economic activity and the major kind of source of leisure there. And drying your own fish is extremely important as a kind of tradition, not just for subsistence or for culinary traditions, but because that's the kind of domestic thing that you do at home. So drying your fish using the kind of the very strong and dry winds to get your fish dried is an extremely important thing. And interestingly, this was part of the competition brief. So in a way, this was already transpiring there. So yes, we have a kind of very large site with a kind of very steep slope. And I would also like to draw your attention to the kind of the conventionally, the prevalent forms of housing there, which of course do not reflect the kind of building tradition of the Faroe Islands, which is much more considerate with the terrain and the landscape. What you've got here, and that's the main worry of the council, are these kind of McMansions, if you know what the term McMansion is, you know, very large detached houses that are absolutely kind of unrelated to the landscape or their surroundings. Very large in size, architecturally quite conventional. You could have this type of house in anywhere, in Dallas, in Texas, in Germany, anywhere pretty much. But they pose a major problem here because again, the soil is basaltic rock essentially. So if you want to build something like this, essentially you have to flatten the land, and that entails using dynamite, massive excavation. So the excavation is as costly as the actual building of the thing. It has a massive ecological impact. From the point of view of urban design, it's absolutely ridiculous. And also these kind of houses, they come in kind of a one size only, so this is very large. And that poses a problem for young people like yourselves who may have gone, if you lived here, you would go to Denmark to study architecture, and you would want to come back to the Faroe Islands, but you wouldn't be able to rent or buy anything smaller than this, and then you wouldn't be able to pay for that, and it would be an issue. So there's something about, you know, making the population return, and also for elderly people, helping them, you know, live in a kind of housing unit that's a bit more agreeable for someone of an elderly age. So without further ado, that was basically the brief, and we didn't have much by way of clues other than this kind of traditional approach to architecture in the Faroe Islands. So what I did for this talk is basically I opened my chest of drawers and scanned every single drawing that we produce for this competition. This is just to tell you how things move from one stage into the other. This was a two-stage competition, actually. So everything started with this, which is not my work or my partner's work. This is the house that Alvar Aalto, the Finnish architect, built for himself, a summer house in Muratsalo in the north of Finland. This is here because when I was in first year, I had to redraw this several times and make a few additions to it. So this is the kind of exercise that you have done for sure. This one stayed with me for a reason. I thought the plan was extremely elegant. It's a courtyard house, extremely well proportioned, and it seemed to yield itself really well to transformation. So it's always been in the back of my mind. So 20 years later, I thought, well, actually, this could be, you know, turned into a kind of the starting point for a project that deals with slope, which is the very opposite of what this does. Now, if you see, this is the first sketch that appeared on my table on a kind of A4 sheet. What you see kind of to the bottom is the Muratsalo house, which I cut with scissors and glued again as a linear typology. So this was just in response to the slope of the terrain. So I was thinking, what would happen if I managed to turn this courtyard thing into a linear typology, a kind of train coach, and leave the courtyard to one side? That could be nice, and I could use this to create a series of steps, which is what you see in this kind of very preliminary section. To negotiate the differences in height and slope, which are kind of, you have many different slope situations across the site. So this would mean that the whole building will be somewhat tilted, at least the roof will be tilted, and that creates an opportunity to have this kind of soil-based roofs, which recover part of the architectural tradition, the good architectural tradition of the Faroe Islands. And it also allows for some space underneath, which is a kind of storage open basement, which is precisely what people need to kind of shelter their chickens and their geese and to hang their fish. I mean, you go there and literally there's fish hanging everywhere, but you need, to provide a space where the wind blows through, but it's also sheltered, but it's also not within the reach of the animals. So this seemed to make some sense. And of course there was a kind of a fireplace, which in a way was, as in Aalto's house, it was kind of critical to the whole development of the thing. Quickly, the thing started to escalate, and the first question was, well, what would happen with the stairs? How do you move from one kind of level to the other? Where would I fit the staircase in Aalto's house? And also, of course, this is meant to be more than one unit. So how would the kind of the addition of units work? And you see in blue my first attempts at, what happens if I kind of make this snaky shaped succession of housing units that kind of gradually negotiate the slope going downwards. If you remember the site, this kind of the aerial view, the higher the slope, of course, you kind of reach the peak of the hill relatively quickly, and it's absolutely barren and bleak, beautiful. And as you go downhill, relatively quickly you reach the docks and the sea. So this is kind of overlooking the fjord, actually, which is, again, gray and blue and extremely beautiful. At some point, and this is still kind of an A4 or notebook format, eventually you had to leave out the kind of the photocopy of Murat Salo and start kind of drawing your way through the project with a rule and a mechanical pencil. So this is the first time in which a kind of serious attempt to fit the typologies that were requested by the competition brief into the organization of the program. And this comes, of course, with 2 elevations/sections, which at this point, there's a kind of concern about where the staircases will be, or can we fit the staircases inside this typology, and more on that will come later. Also, how do you access this? How do you negotiate the kind of slope to reach your individual unit? There has to be some kind of pathway. And one critical thing here, as you will see as the project develops, is touching the landscape became a major preoccupation. Practically not raising yourself particularly high, scraping the landscape, but not using any foundations, or using the very, very minimal foundations. That was, in a way, the key. Not having to rely on any kind of flat soil to sit your proposal was a key question. And it had to do as much with technical questions, like the foundations, as with a kind of sensibility towards the landscape that was there, which was extremely important. There are water streams, there's flora and fauna growing there, and you have to be able to allow it to keep flourishing even after you build your units there. And we thought that was critical in that particular place. At some point, this kind of initial section was kind of enlarged and photocopied, and again with some Photoshop and some glue and some scissors, we developed this kind of elevation collage. And what was interesting is that the whole project eventually became a matter of living up to this collage. In a way, it talks about looking into the fjord with this kind of sky as a background, the immensity of the landscape against the kind of the rock quality of the house with this kind of protective situation. But there was another side to it, and it's important to understand that the wind blows in a kind of a very specific direction. So the other side of this unit will always be more exposed, and one would imagine that it will become quite rugged and weathered with the passing of time, which was, we're fine with that. So these two kind of images, which just come from this initial set of drawings, in a way dictated the whole project. Although, as you will see, there are many transformations after that. At this point, we got to the point of actually having to consider if we are moving from a unit that develops as a system and then is deployed on a site, then how is this deployment going to look like? What are going to be the rules of the game for this particular deployment? So now, as you see, the idea was to produce these kind of strips, curvy or with kinks and angles, that were organized with a single criterion. And it was following the line of maximum slope, because we thought, well, if we have developed this kind of stepped system, it will make sense to try and make the most of it. This is, I mean, when the slope is quite substantial, it's when the kind of the architectural affordances of the units become more dramatic. As you see, the slope of the site is not evenly distributed, so this accounts in a way for the shape of these different strips. Of course, you have to space them, you have to spread them properly, you have to respect some of the water streams that kind of travel downhill, and it's important not to obstruct them. And in a way, you also have to think about how they relate to the kind of the houses over there, as you see in the top part of the drawing, which are actually overlooking the fjord as well. So how do you kind of find your place there? And also, how do you manage to build enough units to make this economically viable? At this point, we had, I think, like 30 units, and we thought that was absolutely fine, and it was not, but more about that later. There was something, as I said, about, how do you sit in the landscape? How do you situate your proposal? This again, is common ground in a way which has a kind of interesting condition. The people in town use it to hike uphill. The animals use it. Some people, have some kind of small fences for keeping a few animals there. But it's a kind of alive, productive landscape. So we thought, well, it would be good if we didn't have a kind of very strict partition of the landscape. You could have a situation whereby your front courtyard, pretty much like Aalto's courtyard, belongs to you in a loose way, and this means that someone else's animals can use it, and the children of your neighbors can also play there. It's nominally your kind of little patch, but it can be used by anyone. In a way, you can count on it. And the rest of the landscape is quite more or less left untouched as something that's worth just keeping as it is. And that was the mentality throughout the whole project. At some point, quickly, you need to start to get a bit more precise. So questions about how do you design the pathway, the kind of descending pathway to reach the different units in each strip as they descend downhill. Which bits need to be flat just to park your car, and how many cars do we need to accommodate for here? That was a big question. What is the ratio of road versus pedestrian access versus kind of raw landscape? What is the appropriate rate? And as you see here, we decided to go for the bare minimum of road, if at all possible. So in this drawing, there's only one main road with one single track, like in the Highlands of Scotland. You just go there with your car, you park up there, and then you descend into your unit, and that's it. If you think about the situation for the kind of McMansions over there, you just see a fragment of the road there, but the ratio of road to units built is massive. It's ridiculous, and it requires, again, lots of dynamite just to make this. For you to be able to park your little car in front of your house. So we decided to be quite conscious about this and make a statement. this is the first serious go at a kind of continuous elevation / section. And I think the sensibility towards the landscape is somewhat already present there. I mean, you just land on the landscape very, very, very carefully. You barely kind of touch it. In a way, we imagine these strips as fragments of rock, as many of the more fragments that are there in the landscape, that would somehow emerge as barren rock at some point. And again, you would slightly lift the whole piece towards the end to look toward the fjord more easily. But you see, there were also discussions in terms of, well, how do you make this thing accessible if you're in a wheelchair? And we discovered, of course, if you follow the line of maximum slope for the strips, then you can also define lines of minimum slope. So that if you are on a wheelchair, you can park your car here, and then this little pathway following the contour lines of the terrain is essentially flat, or it has almost no slope at all. So if you strategically organize which units are appropriate for people on a wheelchair, you get quite a few of them which are accessible in a kind of absolutely flat manner. So that was good. The landscape, nonetheless, was, I mean, in a way, this negotiation between what we built and what we did not build became extremely important. And of course, the landscape was going to be left as it was, but we couldn't pretend that, by installing 30, eventually 40 units there, the thing will remain unchanged. So we started to, in a way, anticipate the future. What would happen? What would the people do in these kind of little patches of land? What would happen in the common grounds? What happens with the streams? What happens when people start hiking using a preferable pathway? So this, in a way, was as important as the build form. So the deadline for the first stage approached, and eventually we managed to marshal this into a CAD drawing, in which I think you see a kind of segmentation of the landscape with the idea of turning this into a productive landscape, or actually the idea of keeping this as the productive landscape that it has always been, allowing for some sort of banding, but also for movement from the north to the south. At this point, I think we managed to get 45 units. So already we thought this drawing was convincing, because it was showing that the ratio that it was, in our mind, highly efficient. The ratio of build form versus infrastructure was quite healthy for the Faroe Islands standards. And then, of course, things got more precise, and in a kind of Rhino and 3D, we started to delve into the domain of representation and construction. How do you assemble this thing, which was going to be prefabricated off-site and then assembled off-site as 3 pieces, plus the staircase, which, as you see here, eventually becomes a kind of plugging thing. So you see, it's basically the same thing over and over and over. Eventually, we switch from one scale to the other, but very often we have to return to the kind of general scale to organize things. At this point, we're really running out of time, teaching and living and so on, and trying to meet this deadline. This is the first moment in which the whole scheme becomes a kind of 3-dimensional model, and you see exactly what the configuration of the landscape is meant to be. We didn't have the time to build a physical model, so we thought, let's fake it. What you see here is a 3-dimensional model rendered in the most unrealistic way possible, trying to use the blur, the focus blur, and the kind of materials to pretend that this is actually a physical model, which at this stage is, I think, much more efficient than trying to, fill this with materials that, you have at this point we have no idea of what this would look like. So let's just not pretend that we do. Let's just pretend that this is a kind of concept, which is what it is. Of course, being tricky, the road, which at this point was kind of cutting halfway through the development, you see it's pretty much the same gray as the landscape, trying to kind of downplay it, whereas the pathways, the beautiful pedestrian pathways are in red, just to make it clear that it's a walkable place, and it is a walkable place indeed. A number of diagrams were made to trying to extricate what different parts of the scheme were. And this is what we submitted to the first stage. So as you see, still very, very early days. There was an idea of, very rugged concrete. We thought this still kind of lives up to the original intent of this kind of sectional or elevation collage. We had this kind of idea of some sheds for tools and for the fish. The landscape remains quite untouched. No one really knows what's going on there, but in a way we thought, well, this is something reasonable. This is not insensitive. And you can imagine, inhabiting this landscape in this particular way. This is as close as we got to developing a proper elevation of one strip according to the real slope. And integrating a number of landscape elements, this kind of semi-private bits of the landscape and how they could be occupied, these kind of access platforms, the main downstairs walkway. In a way, all of the elements were there, although they were going to be transformed very quickly. So we presented this A1 panel, and that was it. We went home for Christmas and then started a new semester sometime past. We didn't hear from that, from the competition organizers for a long time. So we were pretty satisfied. That was it. Eventually, it turns out we were selected to participate in the second stage, which came a bit of a kind of shock in a very busy semester. But 4 proposals were selected to be developed much further, with a view on to select one eventually. So this was the first time in which we managed to travel to the Faroe Islands, actually, and I would recommend it in a heartbeat, really. It's a wonderful place. So we managed to go to the site for the first time, take our own pictures. This, in a way, I think embodies quite well this extremely dramatic landscape, barren, snow, rocky, a kind of mineral landscape with the port, enormous port at the foot of the mountains. In a way, this was a blessing, and I would like to bring back this slogan of Einmal ist Keinmal, because of course we had to start again from scratch. We had a series of meetings with the councillors, with the other competing teams, and it was kind of a very interesting reunion. But this gave us the opportunity to rethink the project from scratch. And this is in a way the main argument that I would like to bring up in this lecture. You develop things and you repeat, and again you see the same drawing over and over and over, and things are gradually becoming concretized, gradually becoming crystallized. Sometimes you kind of lose track and dissolve things a bit. Eventually, because there's a deadline, you just put something together as nicely as possible and as rigorously as possible and submit it. But the project is not finished, it's never finished. You can kind of dissolve it again, you can deconsolidate it again at any given time. And that is not bad. Actually, that's an excellent opportunity, and that's where things start to get really, really interesting. So already, while in the Faroe Islands, we're thinking about, what the mode of representation changes dramatically. This is my notebook, all the notes from myself and my partner as we returned home on the plane. How could we kind of implement all of the results of these talks and these conversations, and having been on the site for the first time? One of the main constraints that appeared suddenly was that the council realized that they actually needed many more units. They needed like 100 or more. So suddenly the scheme had to be double the density, which was a major challenge, but actually it was an extremely positive thing to do because it really had, it really played a kind of dissolving role in the project. So questions of typology or the organization of typologies, questions of growing slightly in height, developing some kind of towery presence, start to appear in these kind of early sketches. So something kind of specific or some new solicitations appear, and they are dealt with at the notebook level. So in this kind of first sketch done after our return to Edinburgh, you see there's already a kind of idea of texture, color, customization, personalization. It turns out that people do not like these McMansions at all, and they like to have, to be able to, in a way, own their own, the aesthetics of their own place. And people want to have a kind of a house that's kind of distinct from the house of their neighbors, and that's extremely important, and we hadn't registered that. But there's also a need to grow in height. I will kind of move faster now. So in the kind of subsequent sketches, which again were, you have to go back to the drawing board and back to pencil or mechanical pencil and think about, well, what does it mean to have these kind of little towery presences, and what do they mean? How can you, in a way, that compresses the kind of the whole strip and allows for perhaps a few extra units to be added to each strip, so that will solve part of our problems. But then once you have these towery presences, how do you use them to look towards the fjord? Because they suddenly afford a fantastic point of view. Should we have some kind of Y-like diverging type in the kind of the unit typology to allow for the framing of different views? So what comes next is an extensive work of more than a month in typological variation, and we, I think, went a bit mad with this. It was wonderful, really, but how many typologies from a one-bedroom that's kind of wheelchair accessible to a 4-bedroom for a young family? People have lots of children there because the level of childcare is really good. So how do you kind of cater for this range of potentials and mix? Actually, already the social mix that was promised by the competition brief was really exciting. So you had compact typologies that had to be kind of re-engineered and turned into this kind of anthropomorphical things in a way. But then there were discussions again about what is it that you can actually customize here. At this point, you see other hands enter the drawing board, and you see the hand of someone else, of one of my partners, Anna. And I think that's extremely relevant. Some people, are drawing in straight lines, and they deploy a kind of more rigid sensibility. Others have a kind of different hands at drawing, and that is wonderful because that brings other type of solicitations and sensibilities into the project. So thank God she started kind of drawing these typologies and, talking about the minutiae of what is it like being a human there. Do we need really, really small windows to in some cases to really kind of organize the facade in a way that is relatable? But my partner Anna is particularly good at urban planning, and that's her specialty, and that's her kind of academic research. So taking firstly an A2 and then an A1 and layering one piece of transparent paper over the other, she endeavored to situate by hand every single element of the master plan, to make space for a sidewalk, to make space for a place for storing the bins, to make space for the streams, to make space for these kind of flat platforms that would in a way create these kind of intermediate spaces, to make space for the road that had to be double track no matter what, to make space for 105 units as opposed to in a way double up the number of units while still negotiating the landscape. So what follows is a kind of increasingly precise and rigorous series of drawings and you have to imagine them as a stack, really, one above the other, in which things become more and more and more concretized, up to a point in which things could almost be kind of delivered at this level. These are beautiful drawings, of course, and you see in some of these upper mini sketches, key decisions are made. I mean, how do you use the kind of flat platforms that you have to provide for parking in the most meaningful way possible? You use them for storage. How do you create these kind of little plots of more controlled greenery? Where do you put the play spaces around the kind of larger family units? So this is all, at this point the drawing was an A1, and of course it was a kind of really happy thing to work in. At the same time, others were working with the kind of the new 3D models and all the affordances. Where would you put your car? Where would you put your bike? Where would you dry your fish? And so on and so forth. Material investigations. I would like to emphasize that, you know, the range of media or the development of the media was not linear at all. So we were jumping between the analog and the digital, and scanning, pasting, cutting, and so on. And what, in a way, in the mind of an architecture student may look like a nightmare, no? Like doing the same project over and over and over. It was an extremely happy semester, actually, because, you know, you were kind of reaching something different every time. So we got to the point of thinking, well, how would you kind of use mass customization to develop your facades? Eventually, after months of work and having, you know, 36 different typologies, we managed to marshal everything into 9 typologies. Small, medium, and large, with 2 to 4 types that would work with all the different types of slopes and so on, and we were happy with this. And again, this was kind of the main decision document. We couldn't, you know, afford to lose this one. So then we entered into production mode, and you see how this becomes a bit of a kind of a musical score: medium, medium, small, medium, medium, small, large, as a kind of way of deploying the system. But that comes with a lot of variation and permutation and redeployment of the same thing over and over again, and fragments and experiments with a fragment to see if it actually fits. And at some point you start dealing with the volume and the materiality. At the beginning, just at kind of a very base level. But you see things start to take shape, although they were already there in the hand drawings. I think nothing was new here. So very often we got back to hand drawings because we thought these were really good ways to define and to describe the life, or how this kind of development was meant to be lived. So you could always draw on top of that, think about where the playgrounds are going to be, where your boat is going to be, because people need to have a place for their boat, not necessarily their car. Where are you going to put your chickens? What's a reasonable fencing? And critically, what is it that you're going to customize? And as you see, there are some hints of color there. And we decided on a kind of mass customization system whereby these kind of towers would be the ones that would, in a way, bring the personality to your home, as opposed to the door, which is the kind of Nordic, Scandinavian way of doing things. But really, the material studies of the kind of mass prefabricated facades got quite serious, and there were kind of questions of density and panelization as a way to also develop different levels of weathering and ruggedness. And eventually, for the kind of last stage of the competition, we developed these, you know, a kind of final presentation drawings. But I would like to emphasize that what's here is here. And I don't know, I mean, I like these images very much, but I don't think they say much more than the previous drawings. Of course, there's a kind of a sense of materiality, there's a sense of, you know, with these green roofs, the idea is that the kind of the texture of the landscape and the texture of the roofing becomes more or less indistinct. So when you look at the development from the other side of the fjord, you see a series of kind of weird linear rocks protruding, but that's about it. And we thought that would be a kind of a very happy thing to have. And I think the councillors were also quite convinced. So yes, again, another deadline approach, and we had to go and present and so on. So, the thing that after returning from the Faroe Islands became really fluid, eventually started solidifying itself a bit. We tried to crystallize it. It became fluid again at some point, or some aspects, and finally, for a final effort, we marshaled this into competition panels, which is what you submit alongside with a model. So you see basically this kind of presentation with a lot of work and detail on how do you put this on site, what these 9 typologies are about, how do you combine these things, how is this environmentally reasonable, how do you kind of develop a kind of online system for mass customization so that you can, in a way, all of the future owners will kind of enter their requirements together, and this kind of form would be generated with all the requirements. So yes, we got this. And this became, in a way, the poster that you've seen today for the talk became the kind of the cover for the booklet that we presented. And what can I say? I like this very much, but and I like the kind of the candy colors of this drawing. My only trouble with it is that it looks like a final thing, and I would argue it shouldn't be the case, and I felt a bit uneasy when I thought, well, that's it. I mean, we didn't win, by the way. A massive studio from Denmark won, and I think with a reasonable scheme, so fair enough, fair play. But we were very happy with this. Still, what happens when you're an academic or when you kind of have a very open practice is that things have a life on their own. And they always come back to you in one way or the other. But by now, I would like to say, again, Einmal is Keinmal, once is nothing at all. And if we had done attempted this once as one drawing or a couple of drawings, it would have been rubbish. I mean, we would have got nowhere. I think that the sense of repetition, the sense of trying to push something a bit farther and not being afraid of the things that are in a fluid state is critical, and that is what we do as architects. And that is not a pain, that is not a problem, that is not an issue. It's actually what makes you happy about being an architect. That's being an architect. Knowing that things are not necessarily finished. And to prove this, this goes on after the competition. So we just left this as it was, but I work in a place that has, my school of architecture belongs to a big college of art, and I have colleagues in sculpture, in design, in many places. And we were kind of still, something was in the back of our minds with this drawing, which is a kind of snapshot of the actual 3D model before you send it to 3D printing or to rendering. You recognize the triangular mesh that the computer sees. It doesn't see your geometry, it sees triangles, and that's it, kind of single thing. We thought, well, actually, this is quite interesting. This has a kind of mineral quality to it, a kind of quasi-crystallographic quality to it that in a way resonates with all these ideas about, this is actually a rock protruding from the landscape, and it's a lame metaphor, but then there's something about, structural growth here that we are quite interested in. So a colleague from sculpture, Cagliari, was developing this really interesting project on the expressionist architects of the early 20th century, the glass chain, and how they were interested in utopia primarily. They were interested in architecture as a form of nature. They were interested in architectures that emerge from nature. They were interested in crystallographic structures and crystallographic formations. They were interested in color. So suddenly, just by meeting and having coffee together, this project became aligned with that line of work 100 years later. And we were both quite passionate about it. So we thought, well, let's do something about it. Let's try to redeploy this as a new glass chain project in which these kind of sensibilities are revisited and redeployed with digital means of production. So the first thing we did as kind of fine arts people that we had suddenly became was to etch, to laser cut this drawing onto an acrylic, a piece of acrylic plastic, not cutting, just etching. And we used it. I had no experience in etching, but Kath did. And we used this, therefore, as a kind of an etching plate to develop a series of etchings that, in a way, would bridge the kind of manual or the hand, or in a way, they would bring back the kind of the manual aspects of the original projects back into the realm of the physical through a digital translation. We were very fond of the kind of the strange texture of this etching series, which was extremely precise and computerized. In a way, it was like drawing what the eyes of the computer see, but drawing it with your own hand, if that makes any sense, or etching it manually. So some kind of really interesting things were going on there. Kath took it really seriously, so an exhibition was made, not just with this, with many other materials on this much broader research project that Kath was dealing with. But it went to Edinburgh, and it went to South Australia in Adelaide, where she took out all of these materials with her. We were really fascinated with the original model that we developed for the competition, and this kind of triangulated thing that this crystallographic world that the computer suddenly redeployed for us. So we thought, well, let's go serious. Let's be serious and try to make a glass model out of this. Let's try to make some kind of statement with this, to give this a new life. We 3D printed this, and I wish I had had this for the competition, because again, it brought to the surface things that we were interested at the moment and we were not able to convey. We also CNC'd it in a kind of piece of dense foam. More importantly, this was done as a way to produce a mold, a silicon mold, that then would be used for casting glass. I'm about to finish, sorry. So this is a kind of flexible silicon mold, which Kath took to the kiln in the Edinburgh College of Art. Glass was molten in the kiln and took the form of this scheme. And eventually to Australia, she took this wonderful model, which is now luckily sitting in my office, which again, we like very much because it has brought the project to a totally different stage, which again, once this series of trials, in a way, keeps something from the original project, but also takes it to some other level of transparency, of crystallography, of a kind of mineral landscape, which was a kind of original intent. And yeah, I could even write a text about it, but that's not. So maybe just to sum up, if once is nothing at all, and I hope this talk proves that things emerge and re-emerge, and if we allow ourselves to dissolve them and to recrystallize them, then we're up to something good. If once is nothing at all, the only choice that's available to us is to do more than once, and I hope you do that in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.